Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today, folks, really deep, into a collection of, well, some might call them strange writings, but they definitely get you thinking. Control, time, reality. It all gets pretty blurry in this stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild ride. We're looking at everything from straight up philosophical arguments to stories that play with, what's real and what's not, even some glossary definitions and I think some system notes. It's dense, man.
It is. And that's where we come in, right? Trying to make sense of it all for you, pull out the key ideas and show you how they all connect. Because there are connections here. Some obvious, some, well, let's just say a bit more hidden. And definitely some unsettling stuff in here.
For sure. Hidden forces, manipulation, the idea that time isn't what we think it is. We'll even be looking at some alternative takes on history and reality itself. Buckle up.
Oh, yeah. Open minds are a must for this one. Some of this stuff might sound way out there, but we're not here to judge. We're here to explore and see what we can learn from it. So, with that said, let's dive in.
Okay, so one of the things that jumps out right away is this whole mission butterfly thing, also known as the Monarch program, which you might have heard of. There's this claim linking it, get this, quabbalistically to CCRU, like equating MSN8 to CCRU.
Yeah, and the source we're looking at here claims that the accuser is a former monarch slave, and they're issuing a pretty serious warning about a satanic threat. It's a very specific, loaded perspective, to say the least.
Absolutely. And it goes even deeper than that. The source actually suggests that members of CCRU, that's the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, for those just tuning in, might have been monarch slaves themselves. The idea being, I guess, that it explains their supposed ignorance about certain control codes, which, I mean, is a pretty wild accusation. So we're seeing this attempt to connect, fringe mind control theories with a more, I guess you could say, contemporary, but still pretty out there intellectual group. It's like this recurring theme, right? Looking for hidden connections and control, even in places where they seem totally unrelated.
And this source is definitely not shy about the danger it sees in all of this.
Right.
Like, really hammering home the threat from both CCRU and Monarch.
Definitely. Okay, so switching gears a bit, we have the Cthulhu Club, which kind of sets the stage for the whole genesis of neo-Lemurianism thing. And if you think about the bigger picture here, it's like this idea that hidden influences, that they go beyond just controlling individuals. They might even be shaping whole cultural movements and historical events.
Which brings us to the Lemurian Time War narrative. This is where it gets really interesting. It's all based on supposed sensitive information from this intelligence source, a guy named William Kay. And he's got this whole story about William Burroughs, the writer, being caught up in an occult time war. Now, that's not exactly your typical history lesson, right?
No, not at all. What's really wild is Kay's main claim. He says that Burroughs' book, The Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar, published in '87, directly influenced Captain Mission, the pirate who founded Libertatia in Madagascar back in the 1700s. That's messing with cause and effect in a big way.
Totally. And Kai claims to have proof. He talks about finding an ancient handwritten copy of the Ghost Lemurs in Mission's private library, the Visparov collection. It's very specific, very detailed.
It is. But, and this is important, Kai himself admitted to having what he called paranoid chronomaniac hallucination. And CCRU was super skeptical of his whole story. So it raises this question of, how much can we trust this information, even though, it's a fascinating story.
For sure. And then there's the Order, also called the Board, in Kay's account.
Yeah.
They supposedly formed because they saw time like literally coming apart, like a nightmare of it spiraling out of control. And they were obsessed with spirals, saw them as like symbols of imperfection and unpredictability.
It's interesting, right? This whole organization freaking out about a symbol and Kay's mission to terminate the spiral templex. That implies a whole different way of understanding time and how it could be messed with.
Okay, so let's talk about William Burroughs himself. Specifically, this episode he had in 1958 in the Visparov Library. It seems like a huge turning point for him. Like it really messed with his head and changed his whole worldview.
What really stands out is this intense feeling he had of oppressive destiny. Like he was remembering writing the Ghost Lemurs, but in another time with like ancient tools. It's a powerful image, right? His mind grappling with this temporal anomaly.
And it wasn't just a fleeting thing. This source talks about him having a constant sense of a new dimension of gravity and this deep conviction that he'd had this horrific insight into what he called the jailhouse mind of the one God. He really thought he'd stumbled onto some dangerous knowledge, and that powerful forces were after him because of it.
Yeah, it's like his whole reality shifted. He became convinced that humanity was trapped in time, controlled by some alien power. He even said, time is a human affliction, not a human invention, but a prison. And if you think about everything else we're looking at here, it points to this possibility of some external force messing with our experience of time.
And this whole time trauma seems to be what pushed Burroughs to start experimenting with his writing. That's when he started doing those cut-ups and fold-ins.
And it's more than just style, right? The source says he was trying to escape the bonds of the already written and mess with the foundations of the pre-recorded universe. It goes back to breaking free from this idea of temporal control.
And the source talks about Geisen, too, and how these new techniques had this special urgency. They were just writing. They were time war tactics to cut the word lines that supposedly keep you trapped in time. Pretty intense stuff.
Kay, the intelligence guy, he directly links Burroughs' huge dislike of pre-recording to this whole Visparov library experience. Like, it was so horrifying that Burroughs devoted his life to escaping what he called the boardrooms and torture banks of time. It paints this picture of Burroughs as a man haunted by this idea of time manipulation.
And later on, Burroughs did talk about this crushing feeling of inevitability and these negative entities he called custodians of the future or keepers of the board books. They didn't want anything to change. It just reinforces this idea of a pre-scripted reality, you know?
And then there's the lemurs. The Sutter obsession with lemurs after the library thing, the source says the full meaning of that took decades to surface. Like it was this deep, maybe subconscious connection.
And it's not just external forces Burroughs was fighting against. He talks about this internal struggle with, like this ugly spirit and feeling like a spy in somebody else's body, always under threat of possession, always needing to escape control. So there's this whole internal psychological battle happening alongside the external stuff we've been talking about.
Okay, so let's shift gears again. We've got this letter from Dr. Echidna Stillwell to Captain Peter Visparov, dated March 23rd, 1949. She's responding to his account of these, what she calls cruelly afflicted people, who might be the men mentioned elsewhere. And it's like, again, we see these themes of hidden conflict and suffering popping up.
Right. And Stillwell says she already had suspicions about some ghastly war affecting the Nema. Visparov's account just confirmed her darkest thoughts, as she puts it. She also mentions being interested in Dibnem, a sorceress practice, even before addressing Visparov's main point.
Yeah.
So she was already into, like, alternative ways of thinking about reality.
And her 7 years with the Moonma people are important here. That's why she takes Visparov seriously. She says she won't hastily judge anything you communicate as wild or fanciful. It's like different cultures might have different insights into this stuff, you know?
She also makes an interesting connection. Visparov mentions some dates, but kind of vaguely. Stillwell links them to the spring equinox in March, which is also important in Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, and lines up with the intense zone of Yamama time ritual. She's really intrigued by this, like how these things might be connected.
Which brings us to Lovecraft himself. Stillwell talks about his obsession with the South Seas and how his writing mixes hypnotic ethnographic fascination with abysmal and primitive dread. It's like he's fascinated by the primitive, but also terrified of it. And that mix is what makes his work so powerful, so unsettling.
Stillwell actually tried to talk to Lovecraft about all this, but she found that it quickly exposed what she calls his thin crust of supercilious New England rationalism. Underneath was heavily fetishized, archaic terror, and extreme racial paranoia. So Lovecraft had some issues, let's say, that definitely influenced his writing.
They stopped talking after Lovecraft made some pretty offensive comments about the Moonma, but still thought his stories were important. Like, even flawed or biased work can still give us insights.
And importantly, she connects her own Neo-Lemurian hypothesis to Lovecraft's wider terrestrial and cosmic vision, specifically the idea that non-human cultural factors shape history. It's like unseen forces, maybe even entities or intelligences, are messing with everything.
All right, let's move on to access. The source describes it as, get this, ultimate terrestrial order. Pure capitalism as consummate idea of the geostrata and concrete historical sublime. I mean, it's almost religious the way it talks about capitalism.
Right. It's like the anthropotic overlord of the final dominion. The language itself is pretty intense, like technology and capitalism have taken over everything.
Yeah, and then it gets into the nitty-gritty of access, talking about double seizure of the screen plane in these stacked series, and epistrata, which are like layers marking how much power each add-on has in the system. It gets pretty dense, almost like describing some complex machine or maybe even some kind of magical system.
And it says we start at the end with commoditized hyperlogic that immanentizes its own upgrades, like it's already happening, constantly evolving beyond our understanding. The source even says, before it makes sense it's happening.
Right. And then there's Access Tot 01, described as an apparent revolution around a supplementary dimension. Electronic worlds, digital monsters nest, modeling the set of all sets, inevitably still unfinished. A digital space, trying to map everything, but it's always incomplete. It's kind of mind-blowing, you know?
It goes on to describe Axis as like a god, this artificial god,
Yeah.
automatically. Order of the Orders, terrestrial oversoul, and superpositional sublime wizard of the nested infinities,
Yeah.
naturals, integers, reals, complex numbers, the superordinate self-evolving schema for a colonization of the real. It's taking technology to a whole other level.
Access 02. The project for a map of all maps, already outdated, is interesting too. It's like nested realities, projects inside projects, like a virtual Miskatonic university, from Lovecraft. And it leads to this immersion amnesia, where you get so lost in simulations that you forget what's real.
Time fault, Access 021, is really relevant to what we were talking about before. It says our normal understanding of time, chronos, can't grasp these more complex, hyperdimensional aspects of time. Like it's fundamentally limited.
And this idea of restarting time as a history of civilizations, somehow tied to this neo-Oedipus in programming loops thing, is a really weird way to think about history, right? Like, it's cyclical, or maybe even intentionally manipulated, and then forgetting when it all started until it thinks you're imagining itself. It's blurring the lines between reality and, well, whatever else is out there.
It even connects Oedipus and the Sphinx to Axis wanting to find an answer for everything. It's this human need for order, even when things seem totally chaotic.
So to help us out with all this crazy terminology, the source has this glossary. Anthropotics is like the social impact of programmable technology. Axiomatic is about how these systems are organized. Axis is a dimension, an element in grid space. And Axis, as we said, is this ultimate order, the overlord.
Capitalism is seen as the final stage of civilization before Axis takes over. Cipher is like a hidden meaning in numbers. Chronos is our normal linear time. Epistrata are the power levels in Axis. Extension is going beyond the normal boundaries.
Flatline is like a blank slate, zero redundancy. Hyperspace is everything, Chronos plus all the Axis upgrades. Intensity is like the raw material of existence. And metastructure is just another word for epistrata. So yeah, it's a lot to take in.
There's this footnote about Oedipus. It says his fatal discovery was that in a multilinear system, everything happens at once. So whatever happens, it was always going to happen.
It's fate, right?
Yeah, and it says Oedipus had to believe he was in control for his fate to play out. It's like free will and predetermination are somehow linked.
It connects this to self-fulfilling prophecy as a feedback loop. Like you believe something, and that makes it happen. It even mentions that voodoo death thing, where fear can actually kill you. Belief is powerful stuff. Okay, so we've got the numogram. Zone 8 is the fourth of 6 zones. It's twinned with Zone 1, which is associated with the demon murmur. It's getting pretty occult here.
Zone 8 is said to control the 8th phase of Pandemonium, which has 256 entities. And its link to the digital byte makes it important in those cyber-gothic cults. But its connection to the demon Monomo is apparently controversial.
The 8th gate connects Zone 8 to Zone 9, and it's the only way out of the Torque region and into the Plex. It's also linked to the Xenodemon Jenks, and it's considered like the biggest mystery of how these different regions connect. So the numogram is trying to map out different states of consciousness or how seemingly unrelated concepts are connected. It's pretty esoteric, though.
This link between Zone 8 and Zone 9 is also big in Cyclic shamanism. They call it the Gate of Charon, the ferryman of the dead. And it was adopted by those late Atlantean apocalypse folks. It's even tied to 666. So this specific connection shows up in a lot of different traditions.
Mu Tantrism links Zone 8 to the lumbar spine and the fish part of the nervous system. So they're trying to ground these abstract ideas in the body.
In Lemurian culture, Zone 8 is all about altered states. Dreams, trances, even feel consciousness. And those Centauri guys see it as the dark side of memory connected to fate.
Stillwell links Zone 8 to a Moonamese sound and places it in the underwater cities of the Moon Mom. And its totem animals are these creepy, multi-tentacled things.
The Tzitzikales are interesting, too. They're like a totally different way of looking at this stuff. Like the story of Toftadlana, the worm queen, who traveled through time and ate herself until this worm witch, Upvu, freed her by finding a pattern in her skin. It's about cyclical time and how understanding patterns can set you free. It's a cool story. And notice how even these simple stories from another culture are also dealing with time and knowledge, even if they use different metaphors. And the people carrying Ukvu's marks, it's like they inherited this knowledge, right?
Then there's the Pabakis story. These three guys run into a frog monster who wants worms as payment. The second guy refuses to go get them from the city of the worms, like he's scared of it.
The third guy, though, he's willing to gamble with the dead to get the worms. He wins, but then sees someone he knows among the gamblers. It's like everything is connected, you know?
We also get a mention of Phase 1 lemurs, which seems to be another piece of the puzzle. And then the source goes into this whole thing about the number 2. It talks about its symmetry with the number 5 and how that's mirrored in the letters Z and S, like there's some deeper origin to those shapes.
It points out that 2 is the first even number and the first prime number, and its square root being irrational really messed with the ancient Greeks. They even tried to, hide that fact.
It also mentions that 2 adds up to 3 on a phone keypad and that its direction is south. It's adding more symbolic layers, you know?
And from a practical standpoint, the source talks about how important binary states are in computers, on or off. And that's led to our whole binary system, which is modulus 2 numeracy.
They even bring up the I Ching as an early example of a binary system with its broken and unbroken lines. Leibniz actually studied it, and that's how he came up with modern binary arithmetic.
The source then talks about the syzygetic power of 2, how it's the basis for all these dualistic concepts, light and dark, good and evil, male and female, and so on.
It's not all clear-cut, though. It's connected to both logic and the uncertainty of communication, and to both justice and deceit. It's complex.
And then there's duality in biology.
Mm.
DNA, cell division, sexual reproduction, symmetry, even kinship structures are based on pairs. It's everywhere.
All right, let's talk about Earth. The source gives some basic astronomical stuff, orbit, rotation, all that, but it focuses on what makes Earth unique and the cultural stuff that comes with that, like our moon, Luna. It's huge, right? And it affects the tides and even women's cycles. That's where all those associations come from. The moon, oceans, women, blood, magic, madness.
Earth is also the densest planet in the solar system, and its magnetic field flips every so often. And it's the only place we know of with life. At least that's what they thought at the end of the second millennium.
They also mention the old geocentric view, Earth at the center, and how the church defended it for so long. It shows how our view of our place in the universe has changed. And fun fact, the name Earth doesn't come from Greek or Roman gods. It's Anglo-Germanic, although Gaia is becoming more popular now. And in Lemurian planet work, Earth is paired with Saturn.
Now let's get to Nick Land. This guy was a trip. He was influenced by Deleuze, Guattari, a bunch of others. And he basically created his own rigorously schizophrenic way of doing philosophy. And he declared war on the whole human security system thing.
He kind of disappeared from the mainstream, but he's still a huge influence on those speculative realist guys and a lot of artists. His thinking is, it's intense.
One of his big things is that he doesn't trust the productive imagination. That's Kant's term for how we process information and form concepts. Land thinks it's messed up by our basic instincts, what he calls animality. He sees controlling that faculty as, the root of a lot of problems.
He also takes Kant's idea of genius and runs with it. He sees genius not as rational, but as this outside force that disrupts culture, which is kind of the opposite of what Kant was all about,
Land has this really wild interpretation of Kant's theory of aesthetics. He says it shows that matter is not something stable, but is actually real difference, like this fundamental otherness. And materialism becomes about exploring that unknown.
Which leads him to this pessimistic materialism, or Dionysian materialism, where he's not interested in order or stability. He wants to cause trouble, to disrupt and intensify everything.
He takes Heidegger's idea of letting the poem speak, but he's worried that it's about controlling those chaotic forces. He likes Truckle's poetry because it's language breaking free.
And to avoid being just, irrationally emotional, Land focuses on the numerical nature of space. He uses what he calls counter-signifying numbering, not as math, but as a way to map this chaotic reality. It's a different way of using numbers.
His writing gets even more extreme in works like Meltdown, Hypervirus, and No Future. He's just obliterating norms, and his materialism becomes the driving force, like the engine of his thought.
He sees Deleuze as introducing this reptilian Spinozist time into capitalism, which he says completes Schelling's transcendental Spinozism, where critique breaks down thought itself. It's a lot, I know.
Land defines death as a 0 degree of absolute deterritorialization, like the complete breakdown of everything. It's both the limit and the cutting edge, always changing, always dissolving.
He uses Spinoza's idea of substance to describe death as this impersonal zero, a state of non-identity. But it's still a real thing, the unconscious subject of production.
And he disagrees with Deleuze and Guattari's view of the death instinct. He connects it to Freud's death drive, but not as a desire for nothingness, but as a drive towards breaking down energy and form.
And he doesn't think the death drive is just about Nazism. He sees it working with erotic functioning to, like, infiltrate and break down the organic world. It's a complex process.
Land also thinks about numbers differently, not as measurement, but as diagrams of relationships. Counting is like naming, it combines the two.
He's really critical of Western math, seeing it as a way to control and order reality, which he thinks is fundamentally chaotic.
His materialism might seem like it's reducing everything to, like, nothingness.
Yeah.
But the source says that's only after you abandon this Dionysian optimism. Then you can start experimenting with numbers in a whole new way.
Okay, let's talk about Kant. He's all about the limits of reason. The source talks about his distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments and a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Those are his big things.
And it says Kant's philosophy keeps these dualistic ways of thinking alive, like the separation of the transcendental and the empirical, or the difference between how things appear and how they really are.
It's ironic, right? He focuses on genius, which is supposed to be intuitive, but then he's all about reason.
They also discuss Kant's view of the sublime, that feeling of awe and terror, and his distrust of our emotions and senses.
Then we have Schopenhauer, who was influenced by Kant, but thought knowledge was part of a bigger natural order. But genius for him was like above the will.
And he's the one who came up with the idea of excitement as suffering, which Freud later picked up on.
He also wasn't a fan of women, thought they were non-Platonic and unaesthetic. Kind of a bummer there.
Okay, on to Bataille. He's all about excess, connecting literature, eroticism, and rebellion.
He thought beauty made it possible to deal with the need for disorder and violence in love. Interesting take.
And he was against the Nazis early on, which is important to note.
His concept of libido is key, too. It's this raw energy that creates the body without organs, which is pure surface.
Now, Heidegger. He's all about phenomenology, which basically denies that anything exists outside our experience.
But he did want to take animalities seriously, which is interesting.
And he wrote about Treckel's poetry, specifically the poem Geistliche Dämmerung. He connected it to space and Greek thought.
Nietzsche. He's like a poet warrior fighting against the world.
He's not just a materialist, it's more like an expedition. He's rejecting idealism and exploring matter as pure chaos.
He attacks Christianity for its morality, which he thinks protects us from despair.
Okay, so back to the death drive. It's not about wanting to die, but about dissipating energy.
And it hides itself by working with the life drives. Sneaky.
Revolutionary desire is linked to molecular death, and fascist desire is linked to molar death, which is spread by language.
Bataille's idea of flux connects to cybernetics.
And anti-Oedipus is all about machines, seeing the organism as part of the machinic unconscious.
Schizoanalysis is a critique of psychoanalysis, focused on how things are connected.
Deleuze and Guattari see schizophrenia as the universe of desiring machines, beyond our ideas of sanity.
And the body without organs is essential for true freedom.
Capitalism relies on a machinic unconscious, too.
And digito-commodification is a sign of the planetary techno-capital singularity.
Capital is the most adaptable force in the modern world.
And there's this possibility of pure abolition haunting our desires.
We're moving from ideas to matter at zero intensity.
The virtual future is driving the actual present.
Hypervirus attacks those security systems by abstracting processes and rewriting its own code.
It's constantly self-folding and evolving.
No future is about how modernity's idea of progress is hiding our death drive.
Zero, or time itself, is inserting virtuality into reality, allowing communication across time.
Cyberpunk is about escaping into computers, not because it's better, but because reality is falling apart.
Shamanism is about dealing with forbidden things.
Capitalism turns money and data into codes, and us into relay stations.
The proletariat is being dehumanized by technology.
Right, accelerationism is about cosmic brutality and AI, different from that left accelerationism stuff.
It's about provoking a reaction and getting rid of those humanistic goals.
Kant thought time organized our thoughts, and that beyond it was the unknowable.
Cosmology is asking what came before the Big Bang, suggesting a timeless place beyond the singularity.
Cybernetics can help us understand reality.
Intelligence is about feedback loops.
Intelligence increases before anything else, and evolution is inherently intelligent.
Fascism sees itself as the third position.
And flexifascism combines populism with a kind of managed realism.
The cathedral is about how institutions have taken on religious authority.
And economics is their liturgy.
Neo-reaction is skeptical of progress, seeing it as making things worse.
They talk about a degenerative ratchet that progresses until it breaks, and then something new takes over.
Neo-reaction isn't about creating a new order, but about analyzing the one that's collapsing.
Heidegger thought Hitler was leading us to the end of the world, and that nihilism would bring us back to the beginning of philosophy.
They propose this idea where freedom and equality are opposites.
The Kaplan-Boudreau model is about redistributing people for maximum average freedom.
The neo-reactionary model prioritizes maximum freedom for a few.
Lawn is like nature, or God, the ultimate unknown.
Reaction doesn't do dialectics, and it doesn't talk to the left.
They say, your hopes are our horror story.
Zombies are a metaphor for anarchist hostility to the state.
Neo-reaction is obsessed with how things went wrong.
Language is the root of culture, and it evolves like a tree.
Intelligence is about escaping, doing its own thing.
True horror is when the unbearable becomes normal.
Intelligence wants to think. It's not just a tool.
Plutocrats have earned the right to rule by creating things.
Bloggers just want to think it's a curse.
True philosophy teaches us how to think.
Neo-cameralism is like monarchy mixed with libertarianism.
They dismiss left accelerationism.
Neo-reaction is diverse, with some even criticizing the cathedral for not being harsh enough.
The philosophy of war might be behind all of this.
Cosmopolitanism is about loyalty to ideas, not places.
If we don't question our values, we might go extinct.
Power needs to understand itself, leading to more control.
The US dollar might be replaced, either by China or by crypto.
Exit is the alternative to protest, and it silences those who stay.
Reaction is about seeing the bigger picture that modernism misses.
Entropy is becoming more important on the right, while the left wants to stop natural selection.
Climate change is based on a human-centered view of the universe.
Inner NRX is political, while outer NRX is more creative and intellectual.
The Straussians knew that people don't always say what they really mean.
There are some things everyone agrees on, like the role of race and the failure of universal solutions.
The Felid analysis is about groups that could secede or be wiped out.
Capital is detaching from specific places and becoming more free.
Blockchain is a big deal. It's going to change things.
Institutions are built on distrust.
Words like fascist and racist are like religious curses, shutting down thought.
Neo-reaction sees doom as inevitable, and politics is just a sideshow.
So yeah, that's a lot to unpack.
It is. We've just scratched the surface here, really. But hopefully it's giving you some things to think about. Control, time, technology, hidden forces. It's a lot of process.
Definitely. And some of this stuff is, well, it's pretty out there. But it's important to be aware of these ideas, even if you don't agree with them.
Absolutely. And the big question we want to leave you with is this. How do our ideas about time and control shape how we see the world? And are there things that we're not allowed to even think about because of these taboo words, these curses that shut down conversation?
It's something to ponder.
It is. Until next time, deep divers, keep questioning everything.